In just a few minutes, this calm daytime interview suddenly shifted into a tense moment on live television. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not because of shouting or dramatic claims, but because two people with very different perspectives simply refuse to move off their positions. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The segment began the same way most daytime talk show interviews do, with Russell Crowe joining the panel to promote his latest film and talk about his recent projects. The atmosphere in the studio felt relaxed, even friendly. Crowe appeared comfortable, smiling as he greeted the hosts and made a few light remarks about being back on American television after spending so much time working overseas. The hosts welcomed him warmly, and for the first few minutes, the discussion stayed focused on his career, his upcoming roles, and how he balances acting with his personal life. Sunny Hostin was the first to shift the conversation into more serious territory, as she often does on the show. She asked Crowe about his thoughts on public figures using their platforms to speak on social and political issues, particularly in the entertainment industry. Her question was framed calmly, but it was clear she was steering toward a broader discussion about responsibility and influence. Crowe listened carefully, nodding as she spoke, maintaining steady eye contact. His initial response was measured. He said that he believed artists should be free to express themselves, but that not everyone feels comfortable turning their work into political statements. At this point, the exchange still felt routine. The other hosts nodded along, and the audience reacted with polite murmurs of agreement. Sunny followed up by saying that in today's climate, silence can sometimes be interpreted as complicity, especially when it comes to issues like social justice, media accountability, and public trust. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it was firm, and the studio noticeably grew quieter. Crowe paused before responding. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, clasping his hands together. When he spoke, his voice remained calm, but more deliberate. He said that he understood the argument, but he didn't fully agree with the idea that every actor or entertainer has an obligation to comment on every issue. He explained that he sees his primary role as telling stories through film, not serving as a political spokesperson. Sunny gently pushed back, saying that when someone has global recognition and access to millions of people, their words or lack of words can carry real-world consequences. She pointed out that many fans look to celebrities for guidance, whether they want that responsibility or not. As she spoke, her body language became more animated, her hands moving slightly as she emphasized certain points. The camera cut briefly to the other hosts, who appeared attentive but cautious, sensing that the conversation was becoming more serious than the usual promotional interview. Crowe's expression shifted subtly. He didn't appear angry, but he looked more focused, almost analytical. He responded by saying that influence doesn't automatically mean obligation. He argued that there's a difference between choosing to speak and being expected to speak, and that forcing opinions can sometimes lead to shallow or uninformed commentary. He added that he prefers to support causes privately rather than perform activism publicly. That was the moment when the tension became noticeable. The audience remained quiet, and the studio energy felt more restrained. Sunny replied that private support is important, but public conversations shape culture, especially on platforms like television. She suggested that when well-known figures avoid discussing controversial topics, it can unintentionally reinforce harmful systems. Her tone stayed professional, but the firmness in her voice was unmistakable. Crowe took another brief pause before responding again. He looked directly at Sunny and said that he respects her perspective, but he fundamentally disagrees with the idea that silence equals endorsement. He explained that people should be allowed to choose the boundaries of their public identity. He said, "I don't think it's fair to assign moral value to what someone chooses not to talk about." His voice remained steady, but there was a noticeable seriousness in his delivery. One of the co-hosts attempted to ease the tension by adding that different celebrities approach activism in different ways, and that there's no single correct model. The comment seemed designed to bridge the gap, but Sunny wasn't quite ready to move on. She acknowledged that there's no universal approach, but reiterated that public silence from influential voices can have consequences whether intended or not. Crowe responded more firmly this time, though still without raising his voice. He said that he believes real change comes from consistent action, not public statements. He emphasized that many people work behind the scenes, funding programs, supporting organizations, and making tangible contributions without broadcasting it. He added that expecting everyone to perform their values publicly can turn serious issues into superficial debates. The studio audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Some clapped in agreement with Crowe's point, while others seemed to resonate more with Sunny's perspective. The camera briefly showed a few audience members nodding along, while others exchanged glances, reflecting the divided reaction in the room. Sunny responded by saying that she wasn't advocating for performance, but for accountability. She explained that public conversations can educate and mobilize people in ways private actions cannot. Her voice remained calm, but her posture was upright and engaged, signaling that she considered this an important point. Crowe listened, then replied in what became the most direct statement of the exchange. He said that accountability should be personal and ethical, not imposed by public expectation. He argued that demanding commentary from every public figure risks turning complex issues into sound bites. He concluded by saying that people should be judged by their actions, not their media appearances. At this point, the atmosphere in the studio felt distinctly different from the start of the segment. The friendly promotional tone had shifted into a genuine philosophical disagreement. There was no shouting, no interruptions, but the tension was present in the pacing of the conversation. Both speakers took longer pauses before responding, choosing their words carefully. One of the other hosts stepped in again, noting that the discussion reflected a broader cultural debate about influence, responsibility, and authenticity. She suggested that perhaps the real issue is not whether celebrities should speak, but how audiences interpret what they say or don't say. This comment helped soften the exchange slightly, and the energy in the room relaxed just enough for the conversation to continue without escalating further. Crowe nodded and agreed that audience interpretation plays a major role. He added that media environments often simplify complex positions, making it difficult to have nuanced discussions. Sunny acknowledged that point, saying that television does have limitations, but that it still serves as a platform for raising awareness. The segment ended this portion of the discussion on a calmer note, but the tension lingered. The hosts transitioned back toward the film promotion, yet the shift felt slightly forced, as if everyone in the room was aware that a meaningful disagreement had just taken place. The audience applauded politely, but the energy remained more subdued than at the start. From a viewer's perspective, the exchange stood out not because of dramatic conflict, but because of its realism. It felt like a genuine conversation between two people who both believed strongly in their positions, neither willing to fully concede, yet both maintaining professional respect. The disagreement wasn't about personal attacks or emotional outbursts, but about deeper questions regarding public influence and responsibility, the kind of debate that often happens off camera but rarely unfolds so openly on daytime television. As the show moved forward, the lingering impression was that something unscripted and authentic had occurred. Not a viral meltdown, not a sensational moment, but a real-time philosophical clash that reflected broader cultural conversations happening well beyond the studio walls. As the conversation moved into the next portion of the segment, the atmosphere in the studio still carried the weight of what had just been said. Even though the hosts had shifted back toward discussing the film, the earlier exchange between Russell Crowe and Sunny Hostin continued to shape the tone of the room. It was noticeable in the way the hosts spoke more carefully, in how Crowe chose his words with more precision, and in how Sunny remained visibly engaged, leaning slightly forward in her chair rather than settling back into a relaxed posture. The discussion returned briefly to Crowe's new project, with one of the hosts asking about the themes of the film and how it reflected modern social realities. Crowe answered thoughtfully, explaining that the film focused on personal responsibility, moral choices, and how individuals navigate complicated systems. As he spoke, it became clear that the themes of the movie overlapped with the earlier debate, even if unintentionally. Sunny picked up on that connection almost immediately. She remarked that the film's message about responsibility seemed closely related to what they had just been discussing. Her tone was calm, but there was a subtle invitation in her voice to reopen the earlier topic. Crowe smiled slightly, acknowledging the link, and said that storytelling often reflects real-world dilemmas, even when it's not explicitly political. Sunny then asked whether Crowe believed films and television themselves carry a social responsibility, separate from the individuals who create them. This question shifted the conversation from personal accountability to the role of media as a whole. Crowe responded that he believes art naturally influences society, but that influence is not always predictable or controllable. He explained that once a story is released, it belongs to the audience, who interpret it through their own experiences. The audience reacted quietly, with a few nods and scattered applause. The exchange felt more reflective now, less tense, but still serious. Sunny agreed that interpretation plays a role, but added that creators still shape narratives, whether consciously or not. She said that choosing what stories to tell and which perspectives to highlight is, in itself, a form of influence. Crowe responded by saying that influence doesn't have to be directive. He argued that presenting complex characters and situations can encourage people to think rather than instruct them what to think. He emphasized that ambiguity in storytelling can be more powerful than clear moral messaging, because it invites deeper engagement. At this point, one of the other hosts interjected, suggesting that audiences today often look for clear stances from public figures, especially in an era of social media and constant commentary. She asked Crowe whether he feels pressure to express opinions more now than earlier in his career. Crowe paused before answering, clearly considering the question carefully. He said that the pressure is definitely stronger today, not just for actors, but for anyone with a public presence. He explained that when he started his career, interviews focused almost entirely on work, whereas now, conversations often extend into personal beliefs and social positions. He said he understands why that shift has happened, but he doesn't always think it leads to more meaningful dialogue. Sunny responded by saying that the shift reflects changes in audience expectations. She pointed out that people want authenticity, not just promotion, and that understanding an artist's values can deepen their connection to the work. Her tone was still respectful, but she remained firm in her view that public figures play a role in shaping public conversations. Crowe acknowledged that authenticity matters, but said that authenticity doesn't always mean public disclosure. He explained that some people express their values through actions rather than words, and that both approaches can be valid. He said that forcing everyone into the same communicative style risks oversimplifying complex human behavior. The audience reaction remained mixed. Some applauded Crowe's emphasis on personal boundaries, while others responded more positively to Sunny's argument about visibility and engagement. The studio felt evenly divided, which gave the conversation a sense of balance rather than conflict. Sunny then shared a personal perspective, explaining that as a journalist and legal analyst, she believes public conversations are essential for accountability. She said that silence from powerful voices can sometimes allow harmful narratives to dominate. Her voice softened slightly as she spoke, making her point feel less confrontational and more reflective. Crowe listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. When he responded, his tone remained calm but firm. He said that he doesn't disagree with the importance of public dialogue, but he resists the idea that everyone must participate in the same way. He emphasized that diversity of approaches, including quiet support and behind-the-scenes work, can strengthen social efforts rather than weaken them. One of the co-hosts remarked that the exchange itself demonstrated the value of open discussion, even when there is disagreement. She said that viewers benefit from seeing respectful differences of opinion rather than one-sided narratives. This comment seemed to ease the atmosphere further, and the tension in the room noticeably softened. Crowe agreed, saying that he appreciated being able to discuss the topic without hostility. He added that disagreements don't have to be resolved to be productive, and that listening is just as important as speaking. Sunny responded by saying she appreciated his willingness to engage, even if they didn't fully align. The camera briefly cut to the audience, showing a mix of thoughtful expressions rather than dramatic reactions. The mood was serious but not uncomfortable, more like a panel discussion than a heated argument. From a viewer's perspective, the exchange felt unusually substantive for a daytime talk show, which often prioritizes lighter content. The hosts then attempted to transition back into a more relaxed tone by asking Crowe about his experiences filming abroad and how different cultural environments influence his work. Crowe responded with a few light anecdotes, and the studio audience laughed, breaking some of the earlier intensity. However, even during these lighter moments, the earlier discussion remained present in the background. The pacing of the conversation stayed slower and more deliberate than usual, as if everyone was still mindful of the serious themes that had been raised. Sunny made one final comment related to the earlier topic, saying that regardless of where people stand, conversations like this help audiences think more critically about media and influence. Crowe agreed, adding that thoughtful disagreement is healthier than silence or conformity. The segment continued in this balanced tone, alternating between professional promotion and reflective commentary. There was no clear resolution to the disagreement, but there was a sense that both sides had been heard. The exchange didn't end with a dramatic moment or a definitive conclusion, but rather with a shared acknowledgement that the issue itself was complex and ongoing. For viewers watching at home, this part of the segment likely felt different from typical talk show interviews. It wasn't entertaining in the usual sense of humor or spectacle, but it was engaging in a more intellectual way. The conversation reflected real-world debates about influence, responsibility, and personal boundaries, topics that resonate beyond the entertainment industry. What stood out most was the restraint shown by both Crowe and Sunny. Neither raised their voice, neither interrupted aggressively, and neither resorted to emotional appeals. The disagreement unfolded slowly, shaped by careful wording and mutual respect, which made it feel authentic rather than performative. By the end of this portion of the segment, the studio atmosphere had settled into a thoughtful calm. The audience remained attentive, the hosts appeared more reflective, and Crowe seemed comfortable continuing the discussion even when it challenged his perspective. It was the kind of exchange that doesn't produce viral clips, but leaves a lasting impression because of its realism and depth. As the segment moved further along, the conversation settled into a rhythm that felt more like a roundtable discussion than a traditional celebrity interview. The earlier tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something quieter and more reflective. Everyone in the studio seemed aware that they were now navigating a topic that mattered beyond entertainment, and that awareness influenced the pacing, the tone, and even the way the hosts addressed each other. One of the co-hosts shifted the focus slightly by asking Crowe about how public reactions to his past interviews have changed over time. She mentioned that in earlier years, responses were mostly limited to print reviews and television commentary, but now social media amplifies every statement almost instantly. Crowe nodded in agreement and said that this shift has fundamentally changed how public conversations feel. He explained that in today's environment, even neutral or carefully worded comments can be interpreted as strong positions once they're clipped, shared, and discussed online. He said that this makes him more cautious, not because he's afraid of expressing himself, but because he's aware of how easily nuance can be lost. His tone was steady, but there was a clear seriousness in the way he described the situation. Sunny responded by acknowledging that social media can distort conversations, but she added that it also gives marginalized voices more visibility. She said that while online platforms can oversimplify issues, they also allow people to hold public figures accountable in ways that weren't possible before. Her voice remained calm, but her words carried weight, and the audience listened attentively. Crowe replied that accountability is important, but he worries about the speed at which judgments are made. He said that people are often expected to respond immediately to complex issues, without time to reflect or learn. He argued that this creates a culture of reaction rather than understanding, where the goal becomes saying the right thing instead of doing the right thing. The studio audience reacted with a low murmur, and a few people nodded. The conversation had shifted into broader cultural territory now, touching on how media, technology, and public expectations intersect. It no longer felt like a disagreement between two individuals, but rather a discussion about how society handles influence and responsibility. Sunny responded by saying that immediacy can be a problem, but silence can be equally harmful. She explained that when influential people avoid commenting, it can leave space for misinformation or extreme narratives to dominate. She emphasized that speaking up doesn't require having all the answers, but it does require a willingness to engage. Crowe listened carefully, then replied in a slightly more personal tone. He said that he has seen colleagues struggle with public pressure, feeling forced to take positions they don't fully understand. He explained that this can lead to burnout, anxiety, and a sense of inauthenticity. He added that he believes people should be allowed to learn and evolve privately, without constant public scrutiny. One of the hosts observed that the conversation highlighted a generational divide in how public roles are perceived. She suggested that younger audiences often expect transparency and activism, while older generations may prioritize privacy and personal boundaries. This comment seemed to resonate with both Crowe and Sunny, and the atmosphere in the studio softened again. Sunny agreed that expectations have changed, and said that she doesn't believe those changes are entirely negative. She argued that public conversations can accelerate social progress, even if they're imperfect. Crowe responded by saying that progress also requires patience and depth, not just visibility. The audience reaction remained subdued but engaged. There was no loud applause or dramatic gasps, just the quiet attentiveness of people listening to a serious discussion. From a viewer's perspective, it felt less like entertainment and more like a live forum, which is unusual for daytime television. The hosts then brought up a recent example of a celebrity who faced backlash for staying silent on a controversial issue. Without naming anyone specifically, they discussed how quickly public opinion can turn. Sunny used the example to illustrate her point about expectations, saying that audiences now view silence as a statement in itself. Crowe responded by saying that public reactions often lack context. He argued that people don't always know what's happening behind the scenes, including private conversations, donations, or personal struggles. He said that judging someone solely based on their public statements can create an incomplete picture. Sunny replied that while context matters, public figures still shape narratives whether they intend to or not. She said that the absence of a voice can be just as influential as its presence. Her tone was still calm, but the firmness in her delivery suggested that she remained unconvinced by Crowe's argument. Crowe acknowledged her point, then responded with what felt like his most reflective statement so far. He said that influence is unavoidable, but responsibility should be self-defined, not imposed. He explained that he believes ethical action comes from personal conviction, not external pressure. He added that when responsibility is enforced by public expectation, it can become performative rather than genuine. The camera briefly cut to the other hosts, who appeared thoughtful and slightly reserved. None of them interrupted, allowing the exchange to unfold naturally. This lack of interruption made the moment feel even more authentic, as if the show had temporarily shifted away from its usual structure. One of the co-hosts finally stepped in, saying that the discussion itself reflected the tension between private values and public roles. She suggested that there may never be a perfect balance, but that open dialogue helps audiences understand different perspectives. This comment seemed to act as a bridge, easing the conversation away from direct disagreement. Crowe agreed, saying that he appreciated being able to express his view without feeling attacked. Sunny responded by saying she valued hearing his perspective, even if she still believed in the importance of public engagement. Their exchange at this point felt less like a debate and more like mutual acknowledgement. The studio audience responded with light applause, signaling a subtle shift in mood. The tension that had characterized the earlier parts of the segment had largely dissipated, replaced by a calmer, more reflective atmosphere. From a viewer's standpoint, this part of the segment likely stood out because of its sincerity. There were no rehearsed lines, no obvious attempts to provoke reactions, and no dramatic confrontations. Instead, it felt like a real conversation unfolding in real time, shaped by genuine differences in perspective. The hosts gradually guided the discussion back toward Crowe's career, asking about his future projects and how he chooses roles. Crowe answered with enthusiasm, and his tone lightened slightly. The audience responded more energetically, laughing at a few of his comments and applauding his upcoming plans. Even so, the earlier discussion continued to linger beneath the surface. The way Crowe spoke about choosing meaningful roles seemed connected to his views on responsibility and influence. Similarly, Sunny's questions reflected her broader interest in how media shapes public understanding. By the end of this portion of the segment, the conversation had found a balance between seriousness and accessibility. The disagreement hadn't been resolved, but it had evolved into something more constructive. Instead of two opposing positions, viewers were left with a spectrum of ideas about influence, accountability, and personal boundaries. What made this moment compelling wasn't conflict, but the absence of it. The calmness, the pauses, the careful wording, and the mutual respect all contributed to a sense of authenticity. It felt like a rare example of disagreement handled thoughtfully on live television, without sensationalism or emotional escalation. As the show moved forward, the impression remained that something meaningful had taken place. Not a viral argument, not a headline-grabbing moment, but a real conversation that reflected ongoing cultural debates. And for many viewers, that realism made the segment more memorable than any dramatic exchange ever could. As the segment continued, the tone in the studio had noticeably shifted into something more settled and reflective. The earlier tension between Russell Crowe and Sunny Hostin had not disappeared, but it had transformed into a quiet undercurrent rather than an active disagreement. The hosts now seemed more comfortable letting the conversation breathe, allowing moments of silence and thoughtful pauses instead of rushing to fill every second with commentary. One of the co-hosts asked Crowe about how he personally decides when to engage publicly on an issue and when to stay silent. The question was framed gently, almost as an invitation for him to clarify his philosophy rather than defend it. Crowe leaned back slightly in his chair and took a moment before answering, which immediately signaled to the audience that he was choosing his words carefully. He said that for him, the decision usually comes down to whether he feels he can add something meaningful to the conversation. He explained that if he doesn't feel informed enough or directly connected to an issue, he prefers to listen rather than speak. He added that he's cautious about contributing to noise without substance, especially in media spaces where attention is limited and messages can be distorted. Sunny responded by saying that listening is important, but she believes that learning often happens through speaking and being challenged. She said that public engagement doesn't require perfection, only honesty and a willingness to grow. Her tone remained calm, but her body language showed that she was still deeply invested in the topic, leaning forward and maintaining steady eye contact. Crowe acknowledged her point, saying that growth often comes from dialogue. He clarified that his hesitation isn't about avoiding criticism, but about avoiding oversimplification. He said that many issues require deep understanding, and that short-form media conversations can sometimes reduce complex realities into slogans or polarized positions. The audience reacted with quiet agreement, and a few people nodded. The atmosphere in the studio felt almost academic now, more like a panel discussion than a daytime talk show. The camera occasionally cut to audience members who looked thoughtful rather than entertained, which was unusual for this type of program. One of the hosts pointed out that television itself thrives on simplification, and asked whether Crowe believes meaningful discussions are even possible in that format. Crowe smiled slightly and said that it depends on the willingness of everyone involved to resist turning conversations into debates. He said that when the goal becomes understanding rather than winning, even short discussions can be valuable. Sunny agreed, saying that respectful disagreement is essential for healthy dialogue. She added that too often, public conversations are framed as confrontations instead of exchanges. Her comment seemed to subtly acknowledge that while she and Crowe disagreed, the conversation had remained constructive. Crowe responded by saying that he appreciated the tone of the discussion and that he felt heard even when his perspective wasn't shared. He said that this kind of exchange is rare in media environments where conflict often generates more attention than nuance. The audience applauded lightly, and the energy in the room felt warmer than before. The disagreement had evolved into something closer to mutual respect, even if the underlying differences remained. The hosts then introduced a viewer-submitted question that had been sent in earlier, asking Crowe whether he feels pressure to be a role model. Crowe smiled at the question and said that he's aware people look up to him, but he doesn't see himself as an authority figure. He said that he tries to live responsibly, but he doesn't believe in presenting himself as an example for others to follow. Sunny responded by saying that role modeling doesn't have to be intentional, and that simply being visible creates influence. She said that people often internalize behaviors and attitudes from public figures, whether those figures acknowledge it or not. Crowe replied that influence is unavoidable, but intention matters. He said that he's more comfortable influencing through the stories he tells and the characters he plays than through direct commentary on real-world issues. He explained that fiction allows people to explore moral questions without the pressure of immediate judgment. One of the co-hosts added that storytelling has historically played a major role in shaping cultural values. She said that films, books, and television often introduce ideas that later become part of public discourse. This comment seemed to connect Crowe's views on art with Sunny's emphasis on social influence. Sunny agreed, saying that storytelling can be a powerful form of activism in itself. She said that representation, themes, and perspectives in media all contribute to how audiences understand the world. Crowe nodded, acknowledging that point, and said that this is why he takes role selection seriously. The conversation now felt less like a disagreement and more like a collaborative exploration of ideas. The hosts appeared more relaxed, and the pacing of the segment slowed even further. There were longer pauses, more reflective responses, and fewer attempts to steer the conversation toward sound bites. The audience reaction mirrored this shift. Instead of reacting with laughter or applause, they seemed more focused on listening. The studio felt quieter, almost contemplative, which is rare for daytime television. From a viewer's perspective, This part of the segment likely felt unusually sincere. There was no dramatic climax, no definitive resolution, but there was a sense that something meaningful was unfolding. The exchange had moved beyond surface-level opinions into deeper reflections about influence, media, and personal responsibility. One of the hosts eventually suggested that the discussion highlighted how complicated the idea of using a platform really is. She said that there's no simple formula for balancing privacy, authenticity, and public expectation. Crowe agreed, saying that the complexity is often ignored in public debates. Sunny responded by saying that complexity shouldn't be an excuse for disengagement, but she acknowledged that there's no single right approach. Her tone was softer now, less insistent and more reflective. Crowe smiled slightly and said that this might be one of those topics where disagreement is inevitable, but dialogue is still worthwhile. He added that he appreciated the opportunity to discuss it openly. The audience applauded more warmly this time, signaling a collective recognition that the conversation had reached a constructive place. The earlier tension had transformed into a sense of shared respect and understanding. As the segment prepared to move toward its conclusion, the hosts thanked Crowe for engaging in such an open discussion. Crowe thanked them in return, saying that he valued conversations that go beyond standard promotional interviews. Even though the show was about to transition into its next segment, the impression left by this exchange lingered. It didn't feel like a moment that would generate headlines or viral clips, but it felt significant in a quieter way. It showed how disagreement can exist without hostility, and how public conversations can be thoughtful rather than performative. By this point, the disagreement between Crowe and Sunny had evolved into something more nuanced. It was no longer about who was right or wrong, but about how people navigate influence, responsibility, and communication in a media-driven world. And for many viewers, that realism made the segment stand out as one of the more substantive moments in the show's recent history. As the segment moved into its final moments, there was a noticeable sense of closure in the studio, not because the disagreement had been resolved, but because it had reached a natural stopping point. The hosts began to gently steer the conversation toward wrapping up, signaling that the show needed to move on to the next segment. Still, the tone remained thoughtful, and the earlier exchange continued to shape the atmosphere in subtle ways. One of the co-hosts thanked Russell Crowe for being open and reflective during the discussion, noting that it's not always easy for guests to engage in deeper conversations on live television. Crowe smiled and said that he appreciated the opportunity, adding that he values conversations where people can disagree without feeling the need to convince each other. Sunny Hostin responded by saying that while she still holds her perspective about the importance of public engagement, she respected Crowe's approach and appreciated his willingness to explain it. Her tone was calm and sincere, and her body language had softened compared to earlier in the segment. Instead of leaning forward, she now sat back slightly, signaling that the debate portion had come to an end. The studio audience reacted with warm applause, louder and more unified than before. The clapping felt less like a reaction to a specific statement and more like appreciation for the overall exchange. It was the kind of applause that acknowledges a meaningful moment rather than a dramatic one. The hosts transitioned into closing remarks for the interview, briefly promoting Crowe's film again and thanking him for joining the show. Crowe responded with a light comment about enjoying the conversation and appreciating the respectful tone. The mood in the studio lifted slightly, and a few audience members laughed softly, easing the remaining seriousness. As the cameras prepared to cut to commercial, the final on-air moments showed Crowe and Sunny exchanging polite smiles. There was no visible tension, no awkwardness, just the quiet understanding that they had shared a genuine exchange of ideas. The segment ended without any dramatic conclusion, which in itself made it stand out compared to more typical talk show moments. After the episode aired, viewers began discussing the segment across social media platforms. The reactions were mixed but largely thoughtful. Some viewers praised Sunny for pushing important conversations about influence and accountability, saying that her questions reflected what many people think but don't always hear addressed on television. Others sided with Crowe, appreciating his emphasis on personal boundaries, private action, and the risks of performative activism. Many comments focused on how calm and respectful the exchange had been. Viewers noted that it was refreshing to see a disagreement unfold without shouting, interruptions, or personal attacks. Some said the conversation felt more like a public forum than a television debate, which made it more engaging and relatable. A number of viewers also pointed out that the segment highlighted a broader cultural issue, not just a disagreement between two individuals. Discussions emerged about whether celebrities should be expected to speak on social issues, how much responsibility comes with fame, and whether silence should be interpreted as a statement. These conversations extended beyond the show, appearing in comment sections, discussion threads, and even short opinion pieces on entertainment blogs. In the days following the broadcast, some media outlets referenced the exchange as an example of how daytime talk shows can host serious conversations without sensationalism. While it didn't generate viral headlines or trending clips, it was frequently described as thought-provoking and surprisingly substantive for a daytime format. Crowe later addressed the interview briefly in another appearance, saying that he appreciated the respectful environment and that he believes conversations like that are valuable even when people disagree. Sunny also mentioned the segment on a later episode, saying that she enjoyed the discussion and hoped it encouraged viewers to think more critically about media, influence, and public responsibility. What made the moment memorable wasn't any single line or dramatic reaction, but the overall tone. It felt authentic, grounded, and emotionally real in a way that's rare on live television. There was no attempt to create controversy, no forced conflict, and no clear winner. Instead, there was simply a shared space for dialogue. From a viewer's perspective, the segment ended the way many real-life conversations do, not with a conclusion, but with a pause. Both sides maintained their positions, but they also acknowledged each other's reasoning. The lack of resolution made the exchange feel honest, reflecting how complex issues rarely have simple answers. In the end, the segment served as a reminder that disagreement doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. It showed that public conversations can be calm, respectful, and still impactful. And for many viewers, that subtle realism made the moment stand out more than any viral argument ever could. So now, it's your turn to share what you think. Do you agree more with Russell Crowe's perspective on private responsibility, or with Sunny Hostin's view on public engagement and influence? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.